Between 1986 and 1994, a shadow fell over the Cape Flats that refused to lift. For 8 years, a predator was hunting children in plain sight, a ghost who moved through railway stations and sandy dunes, leaving behind a trail of shallow graves. His method was always the same: a friendly smile, a request for help with some boxes, and a promise of a few rand. When the handcuffs finally clicked on a suspect in 1994, a nation paralyzed by fear finally breathed a collective sigh of relief. They had a confession. They had a face to put on the posters of the most wanted man in South African history. But as the years turned into decades, a disturbing truth began to emerge. How does a man serve nearly 30 years for a series of atrocities when the forensic evidence at the crime scenes says he wasn't there? How does the state secure a life sentence when the murders continue even after the suspect is locked in a maximum security cell? And why would the very prosecutor who put him away eventually come forward to say he's no longer sure they got it right? Today we're going back to the killing fields of the Cape. We're looking at the evidence that was and wasn't there, the alibis that were never heard, and the 21 families still waiting for a truth that was buried in the sand 30 years ago. This isn't just the story of a hunt for a killer. This is the story of a mystery that asks one terrifying question. If the man who served the time isn't the monster, then who is?
The Cape Flats is a sprawling, low-lying area situated on the outskirts of Cape Town, South Africa. Characterized by a landscape that is remarkably flat, sandy, and constantly windswept, much of the terrain was covered in dense, scrubby Port Jackson bush and dotted with seasonal wetlands that transformed with the weather. Under the brutal regime of apartheid, South Africa's racial segregation laws had forcibly relocated the city's mixed race, or so-called colored communities, to this region. These families were stripped from their original homes in the city center and dumped onto the urban fringe, far away from essential resources and far from the public's attention. Most significantly, they were placed far from the kind of proactive protective policing that wealthier, whiter areas took for granted. Now, while Mitchell's Plain served as the epicenter of this unfolding tragedy, the terror eventually spread across the entire Cape Flats. The fear reached from Bellville South to Balha and from Sarepta near Kales River to the desolate open dunes on the outskirts of Mitchell's Plain itself. These were densely packed, underfunded communities that, starting in the second half of 1986, became absolutely paralyzed by a singular, deep-seated terror. They lived in fear because they knew that someone was actively hunting their children.
On 3 September 1986, a 14-year-old boy named Jonathan Claassen disappeared, marking the beginning of a grim timeline. His body was eventually found lying face down in a shallow, sandy grave near Modderdam Station in Bellville South. An autopsy revealed that he had been both sodomized and strangled. He was the first of many. The violence escalated quickly as the calendar turned. In January 1987, 14-year-old Yusuf Hoffman was found in the bushes near a sewage plant in Mitchell's Plain. That same month, Mario Thomas, a boy from nearby Mannenberg, was discovered in a field in Sarepta near Kales River. The grim discovery showed no signs of stopping, because in April 1987, an unidentified boy was found near Modderdam Station, and by June, 12-year-old Freddie Cleaves was found in a ditch in Balha. In August 1987, 15-year-old Samuel Nkaba was found in the bushes of Modderdam Road. By October of that year, yet another unidentified boy, approximately 15 years old, was found near the same station where the first victim had been recovered. The following year brought no relief. In 1988, 9-year-old Calvin Spire was found in a field near the University of Western Cape. The bodies kept appearing, and a terrifyingly consistent profile began to take shape. All the victims were young boys ranging in age from 8 to 15 years old. They were always found in the same position, lying face down with their hands tied behind their backs in shallow graves. In some cases, their own underwear had been pulled tightly around their necks, which investigators believe the killer used as a makeshift garrote. The killer even went as far to leave handwritten notes beside some of the bodies, taunting those who found them. One of those notes chillingly read, "One more, many more in store." A distinct pattern had finally emerged for the police. Most of these boys had last been seen alive near railway stations, and it appeared they were all lured away with the same exact offer: help carry some boxes in exchange for a few rand. Because of the signature method and the proximity to the tracks, the press gave the killer a name that would become synonymous with South African true crime: the Station Strangler. For years, the investigation into these disappearances remained scattered and ineffective. It was crippled by a police force that was far more interested in crushing political protest than it was in protecting the children of the townships. As the body count rose, the authorities eventually reached out for international help, consulting Interpol and bringing in the legendary FBI profiler Robert Ressler to assist in building a psychological profile of the killer. But even as police sketches known as identikits were shared across the country and a massive 250,000 Rand reward was offered for information, the murders still did not stop. The bodies continued to appear in the sand, one after the other. The reason for this long, agonizing delay was both systemic and heartbreaking. The children of the Cape Flats were never a priority for the apartheid government's security forces. In a system where these residents were treated as second-class citizens, their fear was largely met with silence. It wasn't until the very eve of South Africa's first democratic elections in April 1994, by which time 21 boys had already been found dead in the dunes, that the state finally established a properly coordinated task force. By the time the authorities actually began to treat the case with the urgency it deserved, the Station Strangler had been hunting his victims for nearly 8 years. By January 1994, the terror in the region had reached a breaking point. Cape Town was trapped in the grip of an extreme summer heat wave, the kind that turned Cape Flats into a furnace. The sand radiated heat, and the air sat heavy and still over the townships. It was under these brutal conditions between late December 1993 and the end of January 1994 that 12 bodies were found in what the media began calling the killing fields. These were the dunes near Tafelsig on the outskirts of Mitchell's Plain. The area was thick with the sharp, resinous scent of Port Jackson bush, a smell that searchers and survivors have never been able to forget. January 27, 1994 would become one of the darkest days in South African criminal history. During a massive sweep of the dunes, police discovered 6 bodies in shallow graves in a single day. Among the victims were 8-year-old Fabian Wilmore and 10-year-old Owen Hoffman, who were found lying together in a double grave. They had disappeared on the same day and were last seen together at a local shop. The police also found the remains of 14-year-old Neville Samai and 9-year-old Marcelino Cupido. Marcelino had been missing since the previous December, last seen leaving his grandmother's house to go to a nearby shopping complex. The community responded with pure fury. Thousands of residents formed vigilante patrols, combing through the scorching dunes themselves to hunt for the killer. In Tafelsig, the situation turned violent when a mob surrounded the home of a suspect. The standoff became so volatile that police were forced to use tear gas to disperse the crowd and regain control. The people of the Cape Flats were desperate, they were terrified, and they had every right to be.
January 27th would now forever be synonymous with the day of the 6 bodies. Families across the flats were forced to have conversations that no parent or guardian ever wants to have with a child. Florence Gallant was one of them. She sat the children in the family down to give them a stern warning. She spoke to them plainly about the Station Strangler and the terrifying things happening to young boys across the Cape Flats, pleading with them to be careful and to stay away from strangers. Now, little Alroy van Rooyen had listened to her warning, but he responded with the fearless confidence of a young boy who couldn't imagine himself as a victim. He looked at his aunt and told her, "That man will never get his hands on me." It was a heartbreaking promise that he was never able to keep. On a Saturday morning in March 1994, 10-year-old Alroy van Rooyen and his cousin, Reino, left their home in Strand, which was a quiet, working-class coastal town located about 40 kilometers outside of Cape Town. The two boys headed toward the nearby supermarket, where they planned to spend the early parts of their day pushing trolleys for shoppers in exchange for spare pocket money. By midday, the boys had collected about 15 rand between the two of them, and it was a decent amount of money for two young boys back then. They used some of it to buy food and then headed to their favorite arcade machine nearby, where they played a couple of matches of Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter. As they were walking back to the local shopping center, a man appeared. He stopped them and asked for a favor. He needed help carrying a few boxes to the train station, and he promised to pay them for their time. Now, the boys saw it as an easy way to earn even more money, so they agreed to help. But as they walked, Reino noticed something strange. The boxes were empty. He couldn't understand why a man would need help carrying boxes that weighed almost nothing. When they reached the train platform, a sense of unease began to set in. Reino turned to his cousin and urged him to leave the boxes behind and come with him. But for some reason, Alroy stayed. He boarded the train with the stranger. As Reino stood on the platform and watched the train pull away, he saw the empty boxes being thrown out of an open window and onto the tracks. Reino did not know it yet, but that was the last time anyone would see Alroy alive. On March 19, 1994, exactly 8 days after he disappeared, the search for 10-year-old Alroy van Rooyen came to a devastating end. His body was discovered in the dunes near Eerste Rivier, roughly 22 kilometers away from that shopping center in Strand. The scene was a grim reflection of the many crime scenes that had come before it. Alroy's hands had been tied behind his back, he had been sodomized and then strangled. Even though he was gone for just about a week, the intense heat caused his body to decompose significantly before it was found, and his loved ones could only identify him by the school clothes he had on the day of his disappearance, as well as a small toy he always carried with him.
For nearly 8 years, the investigation had been a series of dead ends and mounting bodies. But in April 1994, just weeks before the country's historic first democratic election, there was finally a break in the case. A glimmer of hope. The breakthrough didn't come from a police raid or a high-tech forensic lab. It came from a woman working at a local clinic. She had seen this man many times before. He was quiet, polite, and remarkably well-spoken. Hardly the image of a predator. In his daily life, he was a trusted figure, a grade 5 teacher at Alpine Primary School in Beacon Valley. She had seen him almost every day, but on this particular morning, something shifted. She looked at the latest police identikit, and then she looked at the teacher standing right there in front of her. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. In that moment, the face on the poster and the man in the clinic became one and the same. She picked up the phone and called the authorities. The man's name was Norman Afzal Simons. He was 27 years old, and on paper, he was the absolute antithesis of the monster the public had imagined. Simons was a highly intelligent man, a college graduate who played classical music and was fluent in 7 different languages, including English, Afrikaans, Xhosa, and French. He was a man trusted with the education of children. However, To Dr. Mickey Pistorius, South Africa's first ever forensic criminal profiler, these were the exact traits she was looking for. This was her very first assignment, a true baptism by fire, and her profile suggested the killer wouldn't be a wild-eyed drifter, but someone literate, high-functioning, and deeply embedded in the community. Someone who knew how to make a child feel safe. To Pistorius, Simons was a perfect glove fit.
On April 13, 1994, the police moved in. Norman Simons was arrested and taken into custody. But what followed was not a standard questioning. For several days, Simons was subjected to intensive interrogation. He would later testify that he was deprived of sleep and kept under such immense psychological pressure that he reached a breaking point where he was willing to say anything just to make it stop. It was during these grueling sessions that Simons gave what investigators called a confession. But it wasn't the kind of confession that solves a case. It was muddled and strange. He didn't provide names, he didn't give locations, he didn't describe the specifics of a single crime. Instead, he spoke about hearing voices and being possessed by unknown forces. One part of his statement read, "I am nothing, I'm dirty, I'm filthy and not worthy. It's very hard to be possessed by unknown forces. These forces cannot be explained by medication." Simons retracted the entire statement almost immediately after it was given, claiming it was coerced. But the community was screaming for justice, and for the state, the evidence, though circumstantial at best, were enough to move forward. They finally had their man.
Before Norman Afzal Simons ever stepped foot into a courtroom, he had already been convicted in the court of public opinion. The media coverage was a feeding frenzy. Sensational headlines dominated the news cycles, with one newspaper famously running a story titled, "I slept next to the Strangler," featuring a former psychiatric patient who claimed Simons had confessed to him in secret. Other reports alleged that Simons had a dark side as a teacher, claiming he would pinch his students' inner thighs as a form of punishment. These stories were consumed by a public that was already on the edge and hungry for justice. By the time the trial began, the atmosphere outside the Mitchells Plains Magistrates Court was like a pressure cooker. Mobs of people stormed the gates, forcing police to stand firm with shotguns raised just to keep the crowd back. The air was thick with a raw, terrifying grief. One man was heard screaming a chilling promise at the police van. "Ek sal jou vrek doodmaak. I'll kill you dead." In this climate of extreme political and social pressure, the state presented its case. Because there was no DNA or fingerprint evidence linking Simons to the scene, the prosecution relied on 4 key factors. First, the retracted confession, that muddled statement about hearing voices telling him to kill. Second, shaky eyewitnesses. Rainer, Alroy's cousin, was the last person to see the killer, but he was so traumatized and afraid that he failed to point out Simons in the lineup. The state relied instead on a second witness, a woman named Fusha Hercules, who saw a man with Rainer and Alroy at the station. She made a hesitant identification, saying, "It looks like him, but I'm not sure." Third, the psychological profile. The perfect fit theory that a literate, trusted teacher was the only person who could lure these boys away. And fourth, lack of a solid alibi. The claim that Simons couldn't prove where he was when Alroy vanished.
Leading the defense was Koos Louw, a former magistrate who took this as his first major case. Louw wasn't just defending a client, he became a man possessed by the evidence, convinced that the police were manufacturing a killer because they couldn't find the real one. Louw began to systematically tear down those pillars. First, he pointed to the scar discrepancy. The police identikit sketch, the one the nurse had used to identify Simons, clearly showed a suspect with a long, jagged knife scar on the left side of his face. Norman Simons had a scar, yes, but it was small and circular. the result of a childhood accident with a paraffin heater. Most importantly, it was on his right cheek. It was a different shape, a different size, and on the completely wrong side of his face. The prosecution had no answer for it. Then, Lowe dropped the biggest twist of the entire case, a detail that still haunts legal experts today. The state had argued that Simons had no alibi for the afternoon Alroy was kidnapped, but records existed that told a completely different story. On the very day Alroy was abducted in Strand, Norman Simons was inside a police station at city centre, sitting with officers, filling out an application to become a police reservist. The police even took his photograph that afternoon as part of the process. The public articles we found do not give an exact time for when that photo was taken, which makes the timeline difficult to pin down with certainty. Later that day, around 2:30 p.m., he was spotted at the public library in Claremont.
On June 14, 1995, the trial reached its end. In South Africa, there are no juries. The weight of the decision sat entirely with Judge Wally van Deventer. Despite the mismatched scars, the retracted confession, and the shaky witnesses, the judge delivered a verdict of guilty. In his final statement, he didn't hold back his disgust. He said, "It is difficult for me in any way to find sympathy for a child murderer." He sentenced Norman Afzal Simons to 25 years for murder and 10 years for kidnapping. But here is the final devastating gap between the public's truth and the legal reality. While the media and the police had branded him the Station Strangler, responsible for 22 deaths, the state only brought the case of Alroy van Rooyen to the trial. The evidence in the other 21 murders was so weak and so non-existent that those cases were never even heard. For the public, the monster was caught. But for the families of the other 21 boys, there was no trial, no conviction, and no justice. Their sons' murders were effectively closed the moment Simons was sentenced for Alroy, leaving 21 cases officially unsolved to this day.
The closure that the community felt in 1995 didn't last long. In 1998, Norman Simons appealed his conviction, hoping for a lighter sentence. The move backfired on Simons. The Bloemfontein High Court not only dismissed his appeal, but they increased his sentence to life imprisonment. He was sent to the Drakenstein Maximum Correctional Facility in Paarl, seemingly forgotten by the world. However, while Simons was behind bars, the scientific foundations of the case began to fall apart. In 2005, an inquest was opened into the deaths of the remaining 21 victims. The boys Simons had never been charged with killing. This was a massive forensic undertaking. Families came forward to give testimony, and DNA samples collected from the original crime scenes were re-examined using modern technology that didn't exist in the early 90s. In 2006, Simons was brought to the Mitchells Plain Magistrates Court to hear the findings. The results were staggering. The limited forensic evidence gathered from the crime scenes, including hair, semen, blood, and fingerprints, did not match Norman Afzal Simons. None of it. Despite the lack of physical evidence, the magistrate stated that Simons might still be the killer, but because so much time had passed, she ruled out any further prosecutions. In 2010, the police formally reopened the investigation as a cold case. Senior forensic officers went back through every single available DNA sample. Again, the result was the same. Not one sample matched Simons. Years later, the original prosecutor, Mike Stowe, who worked alongside junior advocate at the time, Annette de Lange, made a startling public admission. He said it had been established that Simon was in a library in Claremont at 2:30 on the day Alroy disappeared. If true, that matters, because Alroy was said to have vanished near Strand Station around 4 p.m. That left a narrow window for Simons to travel from Claremont to Strand, find Alroy, and then get him into a train. Stowe said he believed that timeline was improbable. Professor Gerard Labuschagne, the former head of the police's investigative psychology section, led that 2010 review. He reached a conclusion that carries significant weight. He believed that Simons was being consciously or unconsciously viewed as the Station Strangler by a public that simply needed a monster to blame. He suggested a much darker reality, that the evidence indicates there may have been more than one person targeting boys on the Cape Flats. And then there is the most chilling detail of all. After Norman Simons was locked away in a maximum security prison, the murders didn't stop. Journalist Gesant Abader documented this in 2023. Bodies continued to be found in shallow graves across Cape Town, children who had been sodomized and strangled in a pattern nearly identical to the Strangler murders. Whether these were copycats or the original killer remaining at large was never officially determined. As Abader wrote, "I will never know whether Norman was the Station Strangler or why the killings continued after the police had their man."
In July 2023, after serving 28 years, Norman Afzal Simons was granted parole. He was not allowed to return to Mitchell's Plain, where the community's anger had never cooled. Instead, he was released to his cousin's home in Parow. His freedom is a shadow of a life. He is under 24-hour house arrest and is strictly barred from speaking to the media. He receives 8 visits a month from community corrections and will be a parolee until the day he dies. The reaction from the victims' families was a mix of devastation and a sense of betrayal. Alroy's aunt, Florence Gallant, expressed the collective grief of the Cape Flats. He's living with his family and he can sit at a table and braai, and our children's voices are silent. The sister of Neville Samai, who was found in the dunes in 1994, was just as blunt. "We will never forgive him. He took our brother away." Perhaps the most haunting sentiment came from a relative of 10-year-old Alino Sprinkle. They pointed out that while Simons was out, the families of the other 21 boys were still in the dark. The police had never visited them to explain why the DNA didn't match. They had been left with no answers and no justice.
Was Norman Afzal Simons really the Station Strangler? If we look at the evidence and the information available today, the only honest answer is that we don't know with certainty. 22 boys were murdered, but 21 of those cases remain officially unsolved. The state secured a conviction, but they never truly solved the mystery. As long as the physical evidence refuses to match the man who served the time, the truth stays buried in the dunes. A shadow of unanswered questions still hangs over the Cape Flats, and for the families of the victims, the nightmare doesn't end with a release or a parole hearing. It only ends with the truth. And until then, the real story of what happened to those 22 boys remains one of the darkest chapters in South African history.